Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kristen Motti, a programs librarian at the Boston Public Library. We are coming to you live from Rabb Hall at the Boston Public Library's Central Library in Boston's Back Bay. We will welcome Professor Robert A. Gross, who will discuss his new work, The Transcendentalists and Their World, and are joined in partnership in presenting tonight's program by the New England Historic Genealogical Society and the Trustees of the Reservations, along with bookstore partner for tonight, Porter Square Books. We'll meet Professor Gross shortly. First, an acknowledgement, a few items of housekeeping, and an introduction from American Ancestor's Margaret Talcott. Since the guest speakers and most of the production team is here at the library together, we acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, and will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, free to all. This is from the institutional statement ratified by the Board of Trustees for the Boston Public Library on September 29th, 2020. And we welcome all of you who are joining us this evening online. Since you are joining us in Zoom webinar space, your microphone is muted and your camera is turned off. We can't take comments in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, but we do want to hear from you, especially if you have questions for Professor Gross. There will, though, be some relevant links shared with you throughout tonight's event in the chat. You can type questions into the Q&A also at the bottom of your screen. We did receive a number of questions already with registration. Thank you for those, and we'll try to get to as many as we have time for. Subtitles and closed captioning can be turned on or off by the live transcript button also at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this program will be available in the coming weeks on the American Ancestor's website and the Boston Public Library's YouTube channel. Now, just a little bit about tonight's featured author. Robert A. Gross is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. He is the author of The Minutemen and Their World, winner of the Bancroft Prize, as well as of Books and Libraries in Thoreau's Concord. With Mary Kelly, he is a co-editor of An Extensive Republic, Print, Culture, and Society in the New Nation, 1790-1840. A former assistant editor of Newsweek, he has written for Esquire, Harper's, and the Boston Globe, and the New York Times, and his essays have appeared in the American Scholar, New England Quarterly, Raritan, and the Yale Review. Now, please join me in welcoming Margaret Talcott. Margaret?
Thank you so much, Kristen. I'm Margaret Talcott. I am producer of the American Inspiration Author Series and the Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society. I am delighted to be in person tonight with folks from the Boston Public Library, and for the first time with our partner, the Trustees, another Massachusetts institution, historically minded, an organization driven to preserve the land and special places. Tonight, Cindy Brockway from the Trustees will be our moderator. As Program Director for Cultural Resources, she is indeed the Trustees' keeper of special places in Concord, of homes and grounds that are intrinsic to Transcendentalism and to Concord's rich history. Her official bio is on your screen right now. You'll see her team's involvement in the Old Manse in Concord, one of 3 national landmark sites owned by the Trustees. Cindy is also the author of 2 books and has published articles in Old House Journal, Colonial Homes, Accent, 19th Century, and the American Public Gardens Association. Cindy, we'll turn this over to you in just a moment, but quickly, I want to remind our participants of the opportunity to buy a signed copy of our Bible this evening. The reason that we are all gathering, Professor Gross's new work, through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. You'll see on the screen the coupon code AMINS20, which is also being placed in the chat. If you use this code as you order online, you will receive a signed copy of the book. This afternoon, Professor Gross put his pen to a limited number of book plates. An autographed copy of the Transcendentalists and Their World could be just the thing for your holiday list. We thank our partners from Porter Square Books for making this possible. Again, you can order from them online and you can ship whatever speed you want. Lots of options there. Okay, and now back to the reason that we are gathering. I want to pass this lectern over to Cindy, and I want to thank her and Professor Gross for taking us on what is going to be a really remarkable tour of Concord, both past and present. Thank you in advance for your insight, and Professor Gross for your very, very fine work. Cindy, the lectern is all yours.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Kristen. I'm really thrilled to be able to be here, and I can't wait to be able to have some conversations with Professor Gross. But first, I want to be able to set the scene for all of you for Concord, Massachusetts, because the landscape and this town are so intrinsic to his wonderful writing that it's important for all of us to have some common ground in order to be able to share. So with the next slide, what I've done is put together just a few images. This of the common, or the central gathering space in downtown Concord, a very bustling, very busy little commuter town with many people traveling to and from Boston, lots of tourists coming in and out of town. The next image shows you the business district, which is just set perpendicular to that little civic center in the community. But here is the view of Concord in the 19th century. A very different look overall, and yet what I find missing out of this engraving are the people, and that is a lot of what we're talking about today, because the Concord of the 19th century that Professor Gross describes is just as bustling as the Concord of today, if not more so. The next slide gives you another image, this very bucolic 19th century landscape painting from Fitzhugh Lane of the rural aspects of Concord, many of which were set and captured in some of the writings of Nathaniel Hawthorne while he stayed at the Old Manse. But as Professor Gross reminded me, it's actually Ezra Ripley who lived at the Old Manse longer than any of these writers that we're talking about tonight, and really is at the heart of some of the theological change that happens in Concord during this period. The next slide is an image of a couple of churches that may come up in our conversation tonight, the First Parish Church and then the Trinitarian Congregational Church, a sort of separation of theology that sets the precedent for some of this thinking during the Enlightenment. The next image shows you, of course, Walden Pond. It's hard to be able to do a little bit of a glimpse of Concord without this landmark place and the writings that came from it. The next slide gives you a sense of where everybody lives today. The Sleepy Hollow Cemetery has a row called Author's Row, where you can go and see the graves and the resting place of all of these incredible writers that have sprung from Concord. The next slide is of course, this battle at the North Bridge. Many of you probably have visited Concord on April 19th in the reenactment, but again, a nod to Professor Gross's earlier book about the Minutemen and their world, and we're going to talk about the comparison of this scene and the scenes in the 1820 to 1840 period tonight. The next slide is just an image, an earlier 20th century image of the Old Manse, in case some of you have not been there or know what we're talking about for a building. This also includes the little garden that was started by Thoreau for Nathaniel Hawthorne and his new wife, and we still continue that tradition of planting a vegetable garden in this area today. And then the final slide is the next to the final slide is one of the trustees and how we are trying in very creative and innovative ways to bring the stories of our cultural heritage, of all cultural heritages, to the public and to our broader membership. in ways that are innovative and foster this interdisciplinary discussion, a little bit of what you're going to catch a glimpse of tonight. This an image of the play Nature, which brings the words of Waldo Emerson to the outside and into the landscape, and the landscape becomes a major element in this play. We have hosted this for the past few summers at both Fruitlands and the Old Manse. The next slide. Just a reminder that the trustees also hold the responsibility for the Fruitlands Farmhouse and the Fruitlands Museum out in Harvard, Massachusetts, where Bronson Alcott took his family in 1843 for his own social experiment. And then finally, an image of the Old Manse, and really a very symbolic image of house, landscape, and this scene by the river where the battle took place. And in fact, this field in front of you was part of the major battleground for those Minutemen and the British soldiers. So I'm going to leave you now and go over and begin our conversations with Professor Gross. And again, thank you all for joining me tonight. There. Professor Gross, I can't tell you how happy I am to be able to have this opportunity to chat one-on-one with you tonight. And I really want to congratulate you not only on a tremendously beautifully written book that's very easy to read, but on the array of reviews that have been coming across my computer this week between the Wall Street Journal and the Atlantic and many, many. And as you said on this publication day, how nice to be able to celebrate this long time of work that you've put into this book. So tonight, I've got some of my own questions, but I'm also going to incorporate some questions from some of the audience members that sent them in earlier. And then later, we'll pose questions, as Kristen said, from those who are watching us right now. So let's start with some basics, just to make sure that everybody starts on the same page. Who were the Transcendentalists? And who were they not? I mean, who were not Transcendentalists, I guess is what I should say. We have this conversation a lot at the trustees. And then tell me how they shaped the image and the philosophy for the abolitionists, for the women theologians, the writers, and other thought leaders that followed. We had a lot of people asking questions about their relationship to people like Mary Baker Eddy, John Brown, Theodore Parker, James Russell Lowell, Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, and even Jane Austen and Emily Dickinson. So maybe you can set that stage. I know that's a lot of questions, but if you can go back and tell us really what were the Transcendentalists, and more importantly, those that people often assume are Transcendentalist thinkers and are not.
Okay, well, can I just say first, thank you to trustees, the Boston Public Library, and New England Historical Genealogical Society. Each of you preside over manuscripts and resources that were central to doing this book. I could not have done the book I've done without sitting in the library in Newbury Street, researching all the families of Concord and poring over the genealogies there. I couldn't have done this book without looking at the newspapers in the Boston Public Library collection, looking at the anti-slavery collection. And I couldn't have done this without going to Sharon, Massachusetts, and using the trustees archive to look at Ezra Ripley's sermons and some Emerson letters. So you have already been part of this book for a very, very long time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So to fully answer your question, will be an undergraduate course, so we won't do that. But it's interesting, the question people often ask is, who were the Transcendentalists and what did they believe? Mm-hmm. Actually, as it happens in the early 1830s, when Transcendentalism burst upon the scene, critics instantly said, "We don't know what you're talking about. It's too airy. You use words in ways we don't use them. The idea of reason you've transformed totally. No one can understand you." And it was a common observation that people would sit in the audience and listen to Emerson or some of the other ministers who were Transcendentalists and say, "It's very inspiring, but I can't get a hold of it." So to ask that question is to suggest that you're already on the critical side, so I'll have to win you over. Okay, so I would say Transcendentalism emerged as a movement, what the scholar Perry Miller once called a religious demonstration that offered an answer to the problems of Congregationalism and Unitarianism in the early 1830s. The question often is asked, why Transcendentalism and why did it appeal to some New Englanders? And I came to realize that maybe that wasn't the right question. The right question is, why transcendentalism in the early 18 to mid-1830s in particular parts of New England? And we can see the problem as the following. By 1832, 33, 34, the standing order of Congregationalism, by which towns voted to establish a church and pay for the meeting house and pay for the salary of the minister, it was falling apart through internal conflict. Orthodox Congregationalists wanted an emphasis upon Calvinism, and some of them wanted a real focus on spiritual renewal and revivals. Others were liberals, like Ezra Ripley in Concord, who emphasized ethical behavior in this world, not conversion to Christ to get into heaven in the next world. They all fought it out in bitter sectarian competition over which church, Congregationalist or Unitarianism, would come to control the town's resources. By 1833, there was not much energy and support left for the standing order. And it's just at that moment that the Unitarian magazines began publishing all of these essays about German idealism and about romantic thought and about what Emerson would call the religious sentiment. And this is the key to what happens, I think. Religious sentiment refers to what Emerson would have said is the spirit of divinity that runs through everyone. Each and every one of us is part of something larger. And we might say that we don't have a common human nature, we have a common divine nature. And each of us has to figure out what that is. Why is that important in this theological sectarian context? That's because facing an immediate breakup of the established church, how are the liberals going to compete for followers? What Emerson and the others are saying is, true religion is not a building. You can worship God on a hillside or in a cathedral. True religion isn't really a dogma, because Christians argue all the time. There's so many dogmas. It can't be a former church government because you got everything from the Catholic and Anglican hierarchies to a Quaker meeting. So if it's none of that, what is religion? And it can't just be ethical behavior because people disagree on ethics. So what's religion? Emerson says it's a spirit of divinity that runs through everything. And that once you see that, you know that every individual is special. Mm-hmm. That every child born is something new under the sun. And that every child, every person is equal in the portion of divinity that each child incarnates, which means, Emerson says, slavery falls instantly. Mm-hmm. So transcendentalism starts as a religious response to a sectarian setting and becomes, especially as it's merging with ideas of democracy and equality in America, a radical challenge to the way the world is.
Fabulous, fabulous. It's such a wonderful way to be able to put it. What I loved most about your book was the liveliness and the realism that you bring to Concord in such an enjoyable way. And you mentioned this floating population of interesting but very different men and women and scores of strangers coming through Concord by the stage for business, for concerts, for attending a meeting, or for other purposes. So can you talk to us about the development of this more diverse community, but a more segmented one that develops here in Concord in the 1830s? And did that breed or challenge the development of transcendentalist thinking? Did it get lost in the shuffle of such a diverse and segmented society?
So I'll come at it from the last end of your question, which is transcendentalism is really addressing a society in profound change, which everything is fluid. And as I suggested in Emerson's views of what's religion, if religion changes, then how do we change with it? So what you described and what I describe in the book is this constantly changing population. Mm-hmm. This is where, by the way, my research at New England HISGen and using its online research is critical. Because I thought, when I wrote the Minutemen and when I did this book, The one answer to the question about what was Concord's history is, first, who lived
is
in Concord?
Concord?
And so I thought it was really crucial to try to figure out what portion of the population was consisted of descendants of original settlers, the old Puritan, revolutionary Yankee population, and who came from somewhere else, and how diverse was the place. Given our own concern about diversity and equity today, there may be people probably not signed in here, but who might say, what's with all these old Yankees that you're preoccupied with? And also, there was a small African-American population that I traced through the book. But what we find is Concord's a market town, it's a transportation center, it's a government center which has, in its courthouse, the courts on circuit a number of times a year, as the county jail where Thoreau would spend his night. So it has a couple hotels, especially the Middlesex Hotel in the center. People are coming and going all the time. Concord makes its living on motion, on fluidity, on the coming and going of people. By the time Concord commemorates its bicentennial in 1835, when it's old Concord in a republic that thinks itself new, only 35% of the townspeople are natives and descendants of long-settled families. Almost two-thirds are people who have come from places, many of which I could never figure out, and stay for a few years and go to places where I can't find them. So that fluidity makes for a social order that's hard for people living then often to grasp, and it strains the bonds of community. Because how do you deal with upholding the notions of neighborliness when you don't know your neighbor?
Right. Why is it Concord and not Boston or New York City?
Well, I think that the same forces are in fact going on certainly in Boston. And for a long time, scholars would say, oh, the center of transcendentalism is Concord, Emerson and Thoreau. Actually, Boston has as much and even larger claim to being the center of transcendentalism. You had Theodore Parker preaching in Boston. You had West Roxbury, the home of Brook Farm. Orestes Brownson preaching in Boston. You had so many of these activities taking place in the hub. And so we might really be thinking of this as more the greater Boston. Yeah, Transcendentalism brought to you by Greater Boston. And so, but I think that there's one key aspect that's worth emphasizing. Emerson comes to settle in Concord because it's his ancestral home. Mm-hmm. His grandfather, William Emerson, raised in Malden, but became minister of Concord around 1764, dies in 1776 as chaplain in a military expedition. But Emerson decides he'll embrace this as his ancestral home. And it isn't just that he's there and that Thoreau is a native born son. Emerson comes to think that Concord is valuable because he can see in the microcosm the same forces that are reshaping life all over the Northeast. And in so doing that, he can watch the lived experience of people with the changes of the era. In his mind, the problem with big cities is he's looking at the rise of mass society. And in the mass, no individual can be distinguished. In Concord, he says, we can see the individual. Mm-hmm. So when Emerson walks from his house at the intersection of the Lexington Road and the Cambridge Turnpike and goes past Haywood's Meadow and onto Walden Street, he will pass Cyrus Stowe, a butcher, meat dealer, who's also a leader of the Jacksonian Democrats in Concord. And from a distance, he'll watch him rallying the troops for the next election. When he goes home, he writes in his journal that a description of this. And he said, "This just disgusts me. All Stowe ever cares about are numbers, how many voters he can rally, and persons, that is, cheer for Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. What I care about is individuals and principles." We don't have to buy Emerson's somewhat self-serving, "I look down on your democracy," but we can see that he's seen some things in the small that the society is displaying in the large. And actually, as I'm saying this thing, I say, so this book is an attempt to put in the small what are the generalizations that we all get in history courses in the large.
Yeah. Well, it does a beautiful job of it. I want to go back to Ezra Ripley a little bit and talk about his liberalism that you describe in the book, because I don't think many people paint pictures of our congregational ministers as being particularly liberal. So I want to know what also the role that women played in his parish, because it's so significant, this role that women had. And then you mentioned that Mary Moody Emerson was the unacknowledged muse of transcendentalism. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that dichotomy between women in the parish, the breakup of the parish, his liberalism, and how that really caused the conservative movement backwards again.
So we might think of Ripley, who was ordained as minister in Concord in 1778, 2 years after he graduated from Harvard College, and stayed in the pulpit until his death in 1841. If you think you heard the same sermon more than once, you definitely did.
It's a long time.
He started numbering his sermons when he started, and when around 1812 he got to number 1500, and he stopped counting. He probably composed some 2,500 sermons over his lifetime. I will not make claim to have read them all. The book would have been a posthumous production. But Ripley, I think we could say this, is that he was the patriarch of a community. And thinking of him as, he would have said, the father of the town, helps us then position him in relationship to liberalism and women. As the father of town, he used to refer to the congregation as "my people." His hold was so proprietary that people always would speak of Dr. Ripley's church. In congregationalism, there was always a distinction made between the people in the parish, all of whom paid taxes for the support of the ministry and care of the meeting house, and the church, who were the body of saints who had proven their conversion to the other members, and they themselves were the core who went to communion, who could baptize their children. That was a sort of broad distinction. In Concord, Ripley, after about 10 years as minister, realized that he didn't like that distinction. He was, in his own mind, I think, the equivalent of an English vicar, a parish priest. He wanted everybody in town to be in his congregation, to be worshiping on the Sabbath. And so he liberalized the doctrines and particularly the rules of admission to get into the Concord Church. We won't have to go down a theological rabbit hole, but so he changes the policies in a broad way so that if you went to his meeting on the Sabbath, you would hear him give sermons really about how we should treat our neighbor. He said once there were only 4 words you needed to know the essence of Christianity: love God and neighbor. And so with that view, he could bring everybody in. But what he wasn't doing was bringing everybody into the church as opposed to the parish. And of the people who joined his church, 70 to 75% of them were women. And so in a sense, the most conscientious and devoted churchgoers were female. So he was going to have to keep them satisfied in order to keep his job. And by 1825, there were more and more rumblings from a small group that his preaching was compromising the old Calvinism too much. And many people thought, all these sermons about how we should behave ethically could often sound like they were just ratifying the status quo. Just be a good citizen and you're fine. So there's a breakaway movement. And the breakaway movement is led by 3 of Henry David Thoreau's aunts and about 7 or 8 other members. And Ripley tries to stop the breakaway. He's unsuccessful. And here's the fascinating thing, goes back to your question about Boston. Word gets out that this little band of Christians are worshiping on their own, and it gets out to Boston, to Park Street Church, which is known as Brimstone Corner, for waging the war of the Orthodox against the liberals. And they send an emissary out in the night, under cover of dark, to find a little band at the centers and say, you want to break away? You want to start your own congregation? We'll give you money. We'll loan it to you. We'll help you get someone from Andover Theological Seminary, the rival to Harvard Divinity School, to be your minister. Let us help you. Let us take charge while we help you. In this setting, and I would come back to where's Transcendentalism and where's Mary Moody Emerson. Mary Moody Emerson, the stepdaughter of Ezra Ripley, has always been discontented with his rational-minded theology. She calls him Dr. Reason. The doctor was for the honorary doctorate he got from Harvard. So she mocks him privately. He's Dr. Reason. But on the other hand, she joins his church, a female member, going through all the procedures to prove she was born again and deserved membership. And then in 1832, after the split, she once again signs the covenant of the Concord Church. She represents a kind of faith that's simultaneously intense. She seeks a personal relationship with God, separate from anyone else. She wants it solitary. And yet, she also values highly the connections to kin and to other women that church membership brings. And finally, she sees herself and is the mentor to her nephews, Edward Bliss Emerson, Charles Chauncey Emerson, and most of all, Ralph Waldo Emerson. She is the caretaker of the family heritage of piety. She's passing on to Waldo the knowledge that, you think Ezra's tedious? Do you think his sermons are dry? Well, be like your ancestors who were unafraid to speak the truth in thunder at their congregants and tell them by name that they're violating the Spirit of Christ by exacting excessive interest on mortgages. Tell them that they're failing in their real duties as Christians.
Perfect. That sounds perfect. It's such a intricate weaving of story and people and philosophy back and forth through this whole book, but it so clearly shows how things are really changing and what a tumultuous time for Concord especially. In your book, you outline that there's 4 parts. Part 1 describes the social transformation that's going on in Concord that we've talked a little bit about. Part 2 talks about the diverse ways in which people are trying to make sense of their changing world. Part 3 talks about how transcendentalism differed from other approaches to this world. And part 4 talks about why it appealed especially to young men and women. So we've talked a little bit about the earlier ones, but I want to come to this point about why you think transcendentalism differed from other approaches to this changing world and why it appealed especially to young men and women.
So transcendentalism, as Emerson articulates it, some of his colleagues do, becomes not just an answer to how do we appeal to people without an established church. It becomes a response to the uncertainties and risks, as well as the opportunities and attractions of a world in change. Emerson says, and so does Thoreau when he's graduating from Harvard, what distinguishes our age is the greater freedom that every individual feels to act on his or her own. Act on economic interest, break with the past, look to new, follow science, be an agent of progress. So also follow your own ideas, follow whatever church you want. But more broadly, once you believe that there's some inner divinity, pursue and cultivate yourself to its highest possibility. That's different in key ways, I think, from other modes of the time. And here I think I point out that it didn't strike me till way into my book that the Minutemen in the World looks at the restiveness of young men and young women when there's not enough land and they're growing up on farms, and they're straining against having to stay in Concord when they know they got to get to new towns they're just starting up. And I look at all the tensions in families over having too many kids and not enough land. It didn't hit me till I was well into this that I'm talking over and over again about efforts to control the young and shape their coming of age. Ezra Ripley doesn't have much luck in getting young men to join his congregation, but the Trinitarians do get young men as well as young women. Though actually Trinitarians also, 70% of their members are female. Yeah. But the Trinitarians are looking for young men who might find an anchor in the church through their conversion. The Freemasons in Concord are looking for young men in their mid-20s, late 20s, who are on the move, who are in trade, are merchants, clerks, are journeymen. Some of them are professionals, but they're constantly trying to start out somewhere. So Freemasonry gives them a hierarchy and sponsors to stay in one place. The Lyceum movement develops as an attempt to initially get young mechanics to participate with their employers in fostering technological innovation and mechanical discovery so that they'll be educated and see that their interests are in common with their bosses. So you've got yet another one. Transcendentalism is also an attempt to speak for young people, but here the difference is it offers a wide view. Emerson realizes that lots of young men are feeling restive with the old traditions and constraints. He doesn't have to look very far. The speakers at agricultural fairs are saying, don't tread in the paths of your fathers. You don't have to farm the way that your grandfather did. Look to the best science, look for the changes of the day, and do that. So Emerson knows there's restiveness, but his faith that we all have within a divine spirit and potential enables him to say, but you don't need an organization to structure your life. You need only the faith in yourself to make this life. And here's a funny lecture in which he's talking about home. And he says, home is wonderful, but you're going to have to learn to give it up. Huh. He's aware that most people in Concord, or most places he's speaking, are never going to stay in the place where they're raised. So if you cling to outdated notions of home, how are you going to be able to adapt when you move elsewhere? And so he actually is saying it's the task of parents to raise their kids to leave them. And it's the task of wives and mothers whose lives are far more constrained than their husbands. It's going to be their task to let go of the kids. But by speaking to a society where everyone's going to have to find their own way, what he's done is come up with, we all have an internal anchor that has to hold us. You know, back in the 1950s, the sociologist David Reisman wrote a famous book called The Lonely Crowd. And when he's looking at 19th century individualism, he says that people then had internal gyroscopes to keep them steady in a world of motion. And I think Emerson's the philosopher of the internal gyroscope.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. Do we have time for one more question, or do we want to take some? Okay, perfect. I want to just talk a little bit about Hawthorne, because you mentioned that he's really a satirist and a critic of the Transcendentalists and not a very enthusiastic supporter. And yet, his Mosses from an Old Manse really crafts a kind of fictional view of Concord. And I wonder if you'd like to just talk to that just a little bit, and his, the power of his influence on this criticism of Transcendentalism.
Hawthorne moves into the manse, Emerson has helped arrange this rental. Thoreau and Jack Garrison Jr., a free man of color, have planted the garden for the Hawthorns. And within 6 months, he's turning out short stories for magazines, including the Democratic Review, which is published in New York, one of the leading magazines of its time. The stories that are being published satirize the perfectionist utopian dreams of the reformers of the age. Got a blemish on your skin that needs to be removed? You're beautiful, but we need to make you perfect? We find out the disastrous consequences. Time and again, the stories that are gathered in Moss's from an Old Man's are about crackpot schemes that go terribly wrong. And that's a consistent theme in Hawthorne's writing. But the preface to Moss's from an Old Man's creates an image of a place that is both lost in time and of a town that's a pastoral place. And so it's really funny when you think about Moss's in the preface. Hawthorne's moved in what, 1842 in the summer. As really dies in November of 1841. Not a long time for the house to be vacant. And yet, Hawthorne describes this place as if it's going into a land of ghosts. Right. The gate is broken down. It looks, just somehow forbidding. You wouldn't trick or treat there. This is a place that could really get you worried. And yet, he conjures up this. He gives you a view of Ezra Ripley and the room where all the sermons are kept in a barrel. The old paintings of the 18th century divines who were friends of the ministers in Concord who preached there. And then he says, he looks out on the battlefield and he evokes that. And then he says, well, I'm not even that interested. I'm interested in where the native peoples once were. And so by the time you're done, Concord is not in the bustling present. It's in a very distant place. And he's conveying here a sense that Concord is as sluggish as the river.
I love that term.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution has passed its by.
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me and strikes me so much that that's the way people would like to perceive Concord in many ways even today. That it is a step out of time and that it does move slowly as opposed to Boston and all the other communities, that are right within the greater Boston region. It feels very different when you drive through there, and there's a conscious effort to try to be able to keep that image alive of Concord.
So I've done over the years talks to National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institutes of community college teachers, of K-12 teachers, and they come from all over the country, and for a long time I would speak to them on Sunday evenings. And they just had time to walk around the center of Concord. And I'd always begin by saying, what do you think of this place? And the Californians and the Texans would say, it's so quaint, it's so historic, it's so old-fashioned. And I would say, really, what buildings do you remember? And they said, there were little churches. What kind? A Catholic church dominating the square. I said, how do you think John Winthrop would have felt about that? How'd you like that Civil War memorial? Do you think it was there when Thoreau was a boy? And you suddenly look at the square and you realize it's a testament to change.
It's true.
Not continuity.
It's true. It's so true. Well, I have a feeling that we have, Kristen has some questions now that are coming in from those that are listening to this conversation today. So, Kristen, would you like to be the voice of our listeners?
Thank you very much, and what an enlightening and interesting conversation. Robert asks, please comment on the relationship between the Transcendentalists and abolitionists John Brown and the role of the Transcendentalists in shaping his image.
By 1859, 1860, I wouldn't say that there was a Transcendentalist movement anymore. The group of ministers and reformers who got together in the 1830s, early 40s, had pretty much dispersed. But the ideas had kind of broadly circulated. especially that there's a higher law, that we intuit it all. Black activists as well as white had embraced that notion that we can all appeal to something we know inside. Concord was a place that in particular supported John Brown through Franklin Sanborn, who'd come to live in Concord after being inspired by Emerson. Concord had a direct tie to the secret backers of Brown. And Brown visited Concord, raised money in Concord, raised money for his adventures in fighting in Kansas. After the failure of the raid, when he was upon the hanging of Brown, Concord and a good many communities had their own ceremonies to mark the death of Brown. And Thoreau in particular speaks out on that occasion and says something that's quite remarkable. He remakes Brown into his own image, and he says, John Brown was a Puritan with all the fiery determination of the first settlers of New England. He wasn't just a Puritan, he was a Minuteman, ready to strike and fight and uphold liberty wherever he had to. Nay, he says, he was a transcendentalist who could live for an idea and forget entirely about the risk to his physical being. Nay, he was Christ crucified upon the cross. And so you're absolutely right that Thoreau and the Transcendentalists play a crucial role in seeing Brown not so much as in terms of the politics of the insurrection he wanted to lead, but as a man whose character had such nobility in his devotion to principle that whether you agreed or disagreed with his tactics, for Thoreau and Emerson, you'd have to admire his being.
Beautiful. And I think Margaret has another question for us now, too, from our listeners.
Yes, I do. Thank you. I'm so enjoying this conversation. A question from Christopher. At that time, in the beginning and mid-18th century, how were the Transcendentalists viewed by society as a whole?
Well, a lot of people said, I have no idea what they're talking about. And they speak this language that comes from the Germans or Carlyle, and I don't have any grasp of this. In fact, intellectuals who were hostile saw German idealism and the language associated with that philosophy as akin to the way American academics in the English departments saw French literary theory. It's something they didn't want any part of. But more broadly, Transcendentalism was seen by its critics as undermining the foundations of society. To Unitarians who were not willing to break with the gospel and with churches, Transcendentalism was abhorrent because it rejected the idea that the New Testament and the Old were revelation. And it appealed to the divinity within any individual, which meant that there's no structure of hierarchy that can contain what people do. But there was a further criticism. Emerson's focus on self-culture was seen by many people who were idealists as finally too selfish, too narrow. Ezra Ripley and then his assistant and successor, Barzillai Frost, criticized the Transcendentalists. In Ezra Ripley's words, they were ego-mites instead of egotists. That word wasn't yet all that common. They were ego-mites, acting just for self, when everybody knew, and I've been sitting here with a quote from Ezra Ripley, who said, everybody knew, no man lives to himself or dies to himself. He is necessarily connected with others, with society, and is obliged to contribute of his powers and worldly goods for the benefit of his fellow creatures. It is thus doing good to others that we find the richest comfort to ourselves. So you could say that the conservatives saw themselves as the do-gooders, And the radicals in their mind, the egomites, were too focused on self. Barzillai Frost says, you really think the problems of society justify you in standing outside and not throwing your powers in? Are there not enough poor people in the streets? Are there not enough drunkards to redeem? Are there not enough prisoners to visit in the cells? Is there not enough work to do to better the society?
Fantastic. Now, Kristen has another question for us.
Stephen asks, what role, if any, did manifest destiny play in the transcendentalist view of nature?
That is a great question, because Emerson gave a lecture called The Young American, in which, in 1844, he appears to be, if you read his rhetoric too quickly, endorsing the idea that America is going to expand from coast to coast. He's opposed to the Mexican War as an aggressive assault on Mexico for the sake of expanding the territory of slavery. But he also says, why do we have to go to war? Everybody knows this Anglo-Saxon race is going to cover the whole continent. Just let these developments happen in time. And so he's still hardly respecting the territory of Mexico. And he imagines the Great West as a garden in which Yankee farmers and others will go and plant free farms all the way to the West Coast. So now you say to yourself, everything's under the plow. He's got absolutely no sense of native lands being taken, and he has no sense of the environmental consequences. You know that Thoreau would have a sense of those environmental consequences. And then he turns in this lecture, in which you're about to throw your book down and say, why ever pay attention to Emerson? And he says, but we have a problem. So many young men are leaving the farms of Concord and New England and going into the cities or trying to get jobs in the growing cities on the frontier, that they're leaving behind their duller brothers and sisters, and what we have are degenerate pig farms. And so we've got to reform the farms by attracting people who made money in business to reform them. And what he has in mind, I think, is that America will be a country of small farms slowly growing out to the west. And so what first looks like manifest destiny becomes still culpable, but an attempt to figure out a way to reform the East at the same time as you're somehow slowing the pace of a conquest of the West. But it's pretty clear he does not see native people in this process. And he doesn't really come to terms with the advance of slavery, except that it's clear that the farms he has in mind are going to be Yankee farms without enslaved people. So he's not imagining the Cotton Kingdom spreading.
Subtle criticism of the South. Margaret.
Bringing us back to the East Coast here, a very precise question, and our last question for this evening. What do you know about the Transcendentalists of Plymouth? Hillside House in Plymouth was designed by Sam Longfellow and surveyed by Thoreau himself. What do you know about that, Professor Gross?
The Russells of Plymouth were deeply engaged with Transcendentalism. And I'm suddenly gone blank on the name of the famous Transcendentalist of Plymouth, who had a model. He was a wonderful horticulturalist, and everybody went to his farm. And it is in Plymouth where Waldo meets Lydia Jackson, who will become his second wife, and she is a dissenter from the liberalism of the minister of Plymouth's First Parish Church, Mr. Reverend Kendall. And her dissent from him is akin to the dissent of of Mary Moody Emerson from Ezra Ripley. And she imagines that when she sees Waldo and falls in love with him, that the two of them will share a spiritual quest together. She has no inkling that he's going to reject the aspects of Christianity that matter immensely to her. So you have a variety of liberals in religion, lovers of nature, who gather in Plymouth, and I think represent not just Plymouth, but many communities all over Massachusetts with their own little groups of transcendentalists, whether they take the name or not.
Interesting, interesting.
What a good answer. And I think with our reading coming up, we're going to go right back into another community. This has been such an amazing evening, and so many aspects of history have been covered. As we do for so many of our series together, Kristen and I have asked Professor Gross if he might do a reading from the book. So if we could turn to that, that would be fantastic. Again, Cindy, thank you for your brilliant questions. And Professor Gross, over to you for this reading. We do have a slide that's up on your screen now related to the reading.
So I'm about to describe a woman named Mary Merrick, who would become the driving force among the abolitionists of Concord. I'm describing her as a teenager. Consider the case of Mary Merrick, who would become a close ally of Cynthia and Helen Thoreau in the ranks of reform. In 1820, the 19-year-old was considered the fairest of the fair among the village belles and eagerly pursued by young men. Her social credentials added to the personal charm. Her father, Tilly, graced the local elite. A Harvard College graduate class of 1773, he had seen the wider world as a diplomat in Amsterdam during the Revolutionary War, and then as a merchant and planter in Charleston, South Carolina, before failing in trade and retreating to his native town. There he tended a small country store with ill grace and modest profit, and dabbled in Federalist politics. At age 42, he formed a family with a cousin 15 years his junior, and persevered until her death in 1816, after which his business steadily decayed. Daughter Mary, the eldest of 3 children, benefited from his connections. She was an intimate of Sarah Ripley, the minister's daughter, went to parties at Squire Hoare's, and delighted in visits to the good old parson's house. The social calls and compliments were balanced by domestic duties. Following the loss of her mother, Mary assumed the burden of running the household for her father and 2 brothers. Amid the endless chores, she found time to read the latest books, including the novels of Walter Scott. She found time to participate in the singing school, to go stargazing, to learn astronomy, to savor moonlight walks on summer evenings. I can hardly suppose a person has a soul who does not love it, she wrote. Nature is my favorite theme. And she found time to maintain a daily journal of her thoughts and feelings, which she sent in letters to a cousin. Like many teenagers then and now, Mary had her emotional ups and downs. One moment, laughing at awkward suitors, the next dolefully predicting she would never leave her father for a husband. She was easily wounded and prone to feel sorry for herself, confined as she was to the home as much as any old tame housewife of 60. Fortunately, she had a ready source of consolation. The moment anything troubles me, she wrote, that moment I begin to think of eternity.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
That is lovely, and what a wonderful portrait of a woman. We've had several people write in saying, oh, tell us a little more about the women, and I'm to say, buy the book, buy lots of other good books. Professor Gross, you've given us a really great portrait of the people of Concord, of history, of transcendentalism coming to life. Has been said in so many reviews, and as Cindy referred to, your book offers amazing insight. It really sets a standard up near Perry Miller's cornerstone work on transcendentalism. A reminder for our audience, you can purchase a signed copy of Professor's new book, The Transcendentalists and Their World, through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. You select the method of shipment. There are so many options. Use the code AMINS20 to ensure that you get a signed copy. order now for holiday giving. Thank you, Porter Square. And as we move toward close, Cindy, do you want to tell us about some events upcoming through the trustees? You can sit right there if you want. Go right ahead.
There's a few events that the trustees do have coming up that I wanted to let everyone know about. The first is our popular Winter Lights program that happens at 3 of our properties that you see here on the screen. But most importantly, I wanted to let you know that the Old Manse is open for tours this winter. And because of the pandemic, we ask that you book your tours online. So the web address that you see on that slide will show you how to be able to go in and how to be able to schedule a tour for the Old Manse. I also wanted to let you know that the engagement manager there tells me that you can take part in themed tours, in attic tours, and believe me, if you don't mind coming up some narrow stairs, the attic of the Old Manse is one of the most wonderful places in the entire building. They're also offering twilight tours as well, so if you want to see the manse and its moods at different times of the day, then I would suggest you might look to one of those specialized tours as well. For Fruitlands, if anybody's interested in going to see the Fruitlands farmhouse, they're only open through the end of November, and then we close for the winter out there. But please come and please visit and please watch for hopefully some programs we'll be doing with Professor Gross over the next year in celebration of this new book as well as his other book as well.
Thank you so much, Cindy. We at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to have presented tonight's author talk along with the BPL and the trustees. If you are researching a history of a community, your family, or someone else's, we do encourage you to come by our research library at 99 to 101 Newbury Street here in Boston and do as Professor Gross has done. He got so much amazing information about Concord communities at our library. As he said, the stacks are open and NEHGS members can visit our digital archives anytime. Also, for the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists. You'll see in the cubes on screen now that we have a lot of great educational programs coming up. And for you literary sorts, join us for more free author talks in the American Inspiration Author Series, supported by our Brew Family Learning Center. Next Monday, November 15, we're hosting a conversation about adoption, including the author Gabrielle Glazer as a member of a panel. If you, your family, or your family tree back through time has been touched by adoption, you will want to hear from these experts. It's going to be a really interesting evening and quite an educational program. And then on December 2, midday, we're looking at the remarkable women in the famous military family from England, the Howes. Indeed, the Howe men fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill and Fort Ticonderoga on the British side, but the women also had measurable impact on the American Revolution. Don't miss author Julie Flavelle coming to us from London for a conversation with award-winning historian Mary Beth Norton. And on December 7, we're presenting the celebrated historian H.W. Brands discussing his new work about the American Revolution with Ryan Woods of my organization and Catherine Algor of Massachusetts Historical Society. They will also explore the art of writing history, as they did with Nathaniel Philbrick in an author event earlier this September. Our mission and all we do at American Ancestors NEHGS is to educate, inspire, and to connect you. Kristen, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Robert and Cindy. To find out more about other events like this one and programs for all ages, resources and services for all ages, please visit us at bpl.org or visit your local branch library. Upcoming author events from the Boston Public Library include on Monday, November 29th, a virtual conversation with Professor Kyle T. Mays and BPL President David Leonard about Mays' new book, out this month, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. On Saturday afternoon, December 4th, both here in Rapp Hall and online, author and podcaster Nora McInerney will join us to discuss her life and work. And on Wednesday, December 15th, author Marcia Rumer joins us virtually to discuss her new book, Parenting with an Accent, How Immigrants Honor Their Heritage, Navigate Setbacks, and Chart New Paths for Their Children. Thank you to our partners for tonight and to Robert A. Gross and Cindy Brockway for being here with us and also for sharing your great work with us. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope to see you again soon, either virtually or in person. Good night, everyone.